Recovered helm picts, fragmented auger logs, and battlefield witness accounts do not describe the beginning of this phenomenon as a single clean medical event. They describe confusion first. A warrior reaches for a weapon and keeps holding it too long. Armour that should be removed after combat no longer separates cleanly from flesh. Ammunition appears where none was loaded. Infected subjects often continue to function during the early phase, which makes the threat harder to identify and even harder to contain. Later records treat the syndrome as a known corruption, but the earliest material reads like scattered observations from survivors who did not yet understand what they were seeing. Only after those testimonies are compared against later Chaos records does the pattern become clear enough to name. The reports concern what later Imperial and heretical archives would call the Obliterator Virus. The established lore does not give one universally agreed point of origin, and that ambiguity matters. Some sources place the roots of the virus in the Eye of Terror after the Horus Heresy, where traitor Astartes and other renegades were exposed to warp-altered plagues unknown to the material universe. One line of interpretation connects it to the broader ecosystem of corruption associated with Nurgle's rot. Another points toward the biological and warp-based experimentation of Fabius bile. A separate tradition, preserved in later Chaos material, presents the virus as a Dark Mechanicum creation, the product of deliberate attempts to fuse machine process, living tissue, and warp influence into one adaptive weapon form. That contradiction is not a problem to solve away. It is part of the subject itself. The Obliterator virus enters the setting as a thing with multiple claimed beginnings, which suits a corruption that blurs the line between disease, possession, mutation, and engineered techno-heresy. What is less disputed is what the infection produces. The virus is the defining corruption behind the creation of Chaos Obliterators, immense warforms in which the host's body, armour and absorbed weapon systems cease to behave as separate categories. Later descriptions emphasize that an Obliterator is not simply carrying armament, it is generating it from itself. Flesh and metal merge, armour becomes inseparable from tissue, weapon profiles can be manifested as needed, and ammunition can appear without a conventional logistical chain. This is why the infection is so disturbing within the setting. It does not merely improve combat efficiency, it attacks the normal relationships between body, tool, maintenance, and identity. The infected host stops being a soldier equipped for war and starts becoming a self-reconfiguring weapons platform whose biology has been rewritten around conflict. Transmission is described in practical and ugly terms rather than mystical abstractions. The infection can spread through bodily fluids or even by touch, and the risk appears to rise with duration of contact. That means contamination is not restricted to ritual laboratories or formal Dark Mechanicum procedures. Close handling, battlefield contact salvage, restraint or medical intervention can all become vectors in the wrong circumstances. The lore also notes that progression differs from host to host. Resistance matters, awareness matters. Willing acceptance may accelerate the process. In plain terms, the virus behaves like a corruption that can be both passively caught and actively embraced. That duality is one reason it remains so difficult to classify. Imperial minds would prefer a clean category such as pathogen, psychic curse, or demonic taint. The Obliterator virus refuses that convenience and operates like all three had been welded together by a very malicious engineer. Its development inside the host is traditionally described in 9 stages, and that stage model is important because it shows the transformation is not usually instantaneous. Early carriage can be invisible. At first, the host may show no obvious outward symptoms while already becoming contagious. After that, the individual begins to display increased familiarity with weapons, almost as if armaments sit more naturally in the hand than they should. The next stage is worse. The host starts physically merging with a held weapon if contact is prolonged, and ammunition generation begins. This matters narratively because the corruption initially masquerades as usefulness. Accuracy improves, handling improves, readiness improves. In a war culture, those are exactly the signs that can be misread as talent, blessing, or hard-earned adaptation. By the time observers understand that the improvement is pathological, the infection is already building a new biological logic inside the victim. Mid-stage development makes concealment difficult. Armor can no longer be removed properly. It begins to repair itself, suggesting that the virus is not only altering the host, but rewriting the relationship between the host and their wargear. Joints rearrange, mobility changes. Metal and flesh cease to meet at a boundary and begin instead to interpenetrate. Later stages allow the absorption and recreation of smaller weapons, then more complex armaments, while the subject's sanity erodes. The records describe bulging growth, distorted anatomy, and a body no longer recognizably human. Strength and durability increase to offset the mounting mass. Eventually, the subject can create not only weapons but bionic limbs and organs, at which point original flesh and demonic metal tissue are no longer clearly distinguishable. This is not mutation as random ornament, it is mutation that behaves like industrial expansion, turning the host into a growing site of weapons manufacture. The biological implications are severe because the virus does not merely scar or swell tissue, it repurposes tissue. A standard human or Astartes body is organized around survival, locomotion, perception, and reproduction of function across organs. The infected body becomes organized around integration and output. Tissue thickens where absorbed material must be anchored. Mass increases because the body is expected to carry, sustain, and regenerate weapon forms. Armor stops being an external layer and becomes part of the organism's working anatomy. Later descriptions of obliterators as hulking, baroque fusions of chaos, space marine, and demon-infused weaponry are not decorative phrasing. They are the natural endpoint of a body whose design priorities have been rewritten around adaptability and violence. By the time the transformation matures, the host no longer resembles an organism using equipment. It resembles a war engine that still remembers it was once alive. The neurological dimension is just as important, even when the sources describe it more indirectly. Sanity degrades during the later stages. The host becomes progressively less stable, as bodily autonomy is replaced by compulsive integration with weapon systems. Earlier stages also imply altered sensor-motor processing. A gun feels more natural in the hand. Aim improves beyond normal expectation. The subject experiences weapon use as instinct rather than trained action. This suggests that the infection is not only changing flesh, but altering perception, reflex loops, and reward structures. The mind is being taught to recognize union with machinery as correct. That matters for understanding why infected individuals may not resist soon enough. The corruption can feel efficient before it feels monstrous. By the time terror replaces fascination, the host's nervous system is already participating in its own redesign. In Warhammer terms, that is one of the crueler tricks the setting repeatedly plays on transhuman soldiers. A major thread in the virus's development is its repeated association with tech marines and with the broader appetite for techno-alchemical mastery among chaos forces. Later descriptions note that many obliterators are former tech marines, which makes grim sense. Tech marines already occupy the boundary between warrior, engineer, ritual mechanic, and keeper of machine lore. They are trained to think through systems, interfaces, weapon tolerances, and sacred maintenance. In loyalist service, that discipline is tightly structured. Under chaos corruption, the same instincts can be redirected into the pursuit of perfect union between operator and machine. This does not mean every infected host began as a tech marine, but the repeated link matters because it frames the virus as especially compatible with minds already conditioned to live in intimate relation with wargear. In other words, the virus does not only prey on flesh, it also preys on a professional identity built around mastery of machines. Its historical development across the setting also shows a clear Iron Warriors connection. Sourced overview states that the first Obliterator emerged among the Iron Warriors during the Horus Heresy, specifically through the possession of an Iron Warrior by the demon Seram, while later material also presents the Iron Warriors as unusually rich in Obliterators compared with other Chaos forces. Some accounts go further and suggest deliberate infection programs or altered strains under Iron Warriors' control, though not every step of that chain is confirmed. Even where the details remain debated, the pattern is consistent. The Legion, most defined by siege warfare, firepower, and brutal technical practicality, ends up especially tied to the corruption that turns warriors into self-manufacturing arsenals. There is no subtle poetry in that. It is just a very on-brand disaster. Warhammer sometimes swings a hammer when a scalpel would do. Here the hammer absolutely lands. Another important development is that the virus does not remain a closed problem inside the Eye of Terror. Later lore points to evidence of activity on worlds ravaged in the wake of Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade, with warnings that the infection can spread through the Imperium even if at reduced strength in the Materium. That matters because it shifts the virus from being an elite Chaos Astartes affliction to a wider contamination risk. The emergence of Obliterator cults suggests that the phenomenon can become socially contagious as well as biologically transmissible. Once a corruption rewards proximity to weapons, affinity for machinery, and acceptance of transformation, it is not hard to imagine how war-torn populations, here-tech circles, and desperate cults might treat it as power rather than plague. The danger then stops being one monster on a battlefield and becomes a pattern of conversion nested inside already collapsing military systems. Perhaps the most telling sign of the virus's conceptual development is that it can extend even into Tyranid bioships according to later cited lore, infesting neural pathways, severing connection from the hive mind, and enabling further techno-biological modification under Chaos control. Whether one reads that as a rare exceptional case, or as proof of terrifying adaptability, the implication is the same. The Obliterator virus is not content with ordinary species boundaries or conventional machine categories. It seeks interfaces, it exploits connection points, it spreads where biology, technology, and command systems meet. That makes it one of the more revealing corruptions in Warhammer 40,000. Many diseases in the setting kill, many mutations distort. This one develops. It studies the host by consuming the host, then refits the host into a platform for escalating armament. By the end of its first chapter in the lore, it is already more than a virus in the mundane sense. It is a doctrine of fusion made infectious. The Obliterator virus begins in uncertainty, develops through contact and stage corruption, and reaches maturity through the systematic collapse of boundaries between body, armor, weapon, and will. Its earlier symptoms can look useful. Its later structure reveals a complete reordering of life around combat integration. Competing origin accounts tie it to the Eye of Terror, to warp-altered plague traditions, to Fabius Bile's experimental culture, and to the Dark Mechanicum's drive to merge flesh with machinery. Its most famous hosts are Chaos Space Marines, often with strong links to Tech Marine expertise and Iron Warriors practice. From that base, the subject grows into one of the setting's clearest examples of technological corruption no longer behaving like technology at all, but like a living battlefield principle. That foundation leads directly into the next section, where the biological, neural, and personality consequences become impossible to separate from the warform they create. By the time the infection advances beyond its early integration phases, the host organism is no longer operating under familiar biological constraints. What began as subtle compatibility with weapons evolves into a complete restructuring of tissue purpose. The body ceases to behave as a stable anatomical system, and instead becomes a reactive substrate designed to absorb, replicate, and sustain armament. This is not a simple mutation in the sense of added growth or deformity. It is a conversion of biological identity into a continuous state of adaptive production. Mass increases steadily as the infection progresses. This increase is not random accumulation, but functional expansion. Muscle groups thicken beyond baseline requirements for locomotion, supporting the weight and recoil of integrated weapon systems. Bone density rises to prevent structural collapse under internal stress. In Astartes hosts, whose physiology is already engineered for resilience, the virus compounds existing enhancements and drives them toward excess. Joints widen and reposition to accommodate altered limb geometry, allowing for weapon deployment angles that would be mechanically impossible for an uninfected frame. The skin, where it remains identifiable, thickens and hardens into a composite layer that resembles ceramite more than organic tissue. In many documented cases, this outer layer becomes indistinguishable from the host's armor. Rather than wearing protective plating, the infected subject becomes its own armor system. Surface textures shift over time, forming ridges, vents, and apertures that correspond to weapon output points. These structures are not decorative mutations. They are functional ports, enabling the emission of projectiles, energy discharges, or other destructive outputs generated internally. Internally, organ systems are either repurposed or rendered obsolete. Traditional metabolic processes no longer fully explain how the host sustains itself. While some biological function remains, it is supplemented or overridden by warp-influenced energy conversion. The host begins to operate less like a creature dependent on external sustenance and more like a self-contained engine, drawing power from both physical and immaterial sources. This explains the documented ability of obliterators to generate ammunition without conventional supply. The body is no longer consuming resources in a linear way. It is transforming matter and energy through processes that defy standard biological interpretation. Circulatory changes follow. Blood, if still present in recognizable form, becomes thickened and interlaced with metallic particulates. These particulates are not foreign contaminants in the usual sense. They are integrated components of the host's new physiology, assisting in the transport of materials necessary for rapid weapon formation and repair. Wounds that would disable or kill an uninfected individual are often sealed not by traditional clotting but by instantaneous restructuring of surrounding tissue. Flesh and metal flow together to close breaches, creating a form of regeneration that is both biological and mechanical in nature. Respiration becomes inconsistent. Some infected subjects continue to breathe, though the necessity of oxygen exchange appears diminished. Others show minimal respiratory activity, suggesting that conventional gas exchange is no longer critical. This aligns with observations that obliterators can operate in hostile environments without standard life support, further indicating that their internal systems are no longer bound to baseline human requirements. Growth does not stabilize at a fixed endpoint. Even after reaching a recognizable obliterator form, the body continues to evolve. New weapon systems can be integrated through contact with external machinery. Smaller weapons are absorbed directly into the flesh, broken down, and reconstituted as part of the host's internal arsenal. Larger systems may require prolonged contact or partial disassembly, but the end result remains consistent. The host gains the capacity to reproduce the function of the absorbed weapon without needing to physically carry it again. Over time, this leads to an accumulation of capabilities that far exceeds any standard loadout. The most disturbing aspect of this biological transformation is not its scale, but its direction. The body is no longer organized around survival of the individual organism. It is organized around sustained combat output. Every structural change supports that singular objective. Mobility is preserved only insofar as it enables positioning for effective fire. Sensory systems are retained or altered to improve targeting and threat detection. All other biological priorities are either diminished or eliminated. The neural effects of the Obliterator virus develop alongside and in support of these physical changes. Early stages suggest enhanced motor coordination when handling weapons. This is not simple training or muscle memory. It is a restructuring of neural pathways that prioritizes weapon integration as a default state. The host begins to process a firearm or heavy weapon as an extension of their own body schema. This shift is subtle at first, presenting as improved efficiency, faster targeting, and reduced hesitation. As the infection progresses, this integration deepens. The brain no longer distinguishes clearly between internal limb movement and external weapon manipulation. Signals that would normally be used to control muscle groups are redirected or duplicated to operate integrated systems. This allows for simultaneous management of multiple weapon outputs without the cognitive overload that would incapacitate an uninfected individual. The host can track targets, adjust firing parameters, and coordinate movement with a level of fluidity that suggests a merged control architecture. Sensory perception is also altered. Vision may be augmented by internal targeting systems, either biological or techno-organic in nature. Some accounts describe multispectral perception, though the exact mechanism is not consistently defined. What is consistent is the host's increased accuracy and awareness of battlefield variables. Range, trajectory, and target movement are processed with minimal conscious effort. This implies that significant portions of what would normally be conscious calculation are offloaded to automated processes within the altered nervous system. Pain response undergoes a major shift. In many cases, sensitivity to damage is reduced or reinterpreted. Pain does not disappear entirely, but is reframed as a functional signal rather than a deterrent. Damage becomes information about structural integrity rather than a warning to withdraw. This allows the host to continue operating under conditions that would incapacitate or overwhelm an uninfected mind. It also contributes to the overall impression that the infected individual is less concerned with self-preservation and more focused on maintaining output. Memory and identity are progressively destabilized. Early on, the host retains awareness of their previous self, though this awareness may be accompanied by intrusive impulses related to weapon integration. Over time, these impulses intensify, and the boundary between voluntary action and compulsion erodes. The desire to merge with weapons, to absorb new systems, and to expand capabilities becomes a dominant cognitive drive. In later stages, coherent identity fragments. The host may still recognize allies and enemies, but this recognition is filtered through a narrowed set of priorities centered on combat. Personal history, social bonds, and abstract reasoning diminish in importance. What remains is a functional intelligence optimized for warfare. It is important to note that this is not total cognitive collapse. Obliterators retain a form of tactical awareness and can operate effectively within coordinated assaults. However, their decision-making is heavily biased toward immediate destructive potential. The influence of the warp complicates this neurological transformation further. The virus is not purely biological, and its interaction with the host's mind cannot be explained solely through physical restructuring. There are indications of demonic presence or influence embedded within the infection. This may manifest as intrusive thoughts, altered perception of reality, or an underlying sense of compulsion that does not originate from the host's original personality. Whether this influence constitutes possession, symbiosis, or something in between is not consistently defined, but its effects are evident in the host's behavioral changes. Personality alteration follows a predictable trajectory aligned with the physical and neural changes. In the early stages, the host may experience increased confidence or even a sense of empowerment. Enhanced combat ability reinforces existing warrior identities, particularly in Astartes who already define themselves through martial excellence. This can delay recognition of the infection as a threat, as the immediate effects appear beneficial. As the transformation continues, this confidence shifts into obsession. The host becomes fixated on weapons, not just as tools but as objects of integration. Time that would normally be spent on rest, communication, or strategic planning is redirected toward interaction with armament. The individual may seek out new weapons compulsively, prioritizing acquisition and contact over other objectives. Emotional range narrows, empathy diminishes, replaced by a detached focus on function. Interpersonal relationships degrade as the host becomes less capable of engaging with others outside of combat contexts. In organized forces, this can lead to isolation even before the physical transformation becomes obvious. Other soldiers may recognize behavioral changes and distance themselves, further accelerating the host's detachment. In advanced stages, personality as a distinct construct is largely subsumed by the infection's directives. The host does not become mindless, but their individuality is reduced to a framework that supports the virus's objectives. Aggression becomes constant, though it is often controlled rather than indiscriminate. The host is not simply enraged. They are purpose-driven in a way that aligns with continuous combat readiness and expansion of capability. What remains of the original personality may surface intermittently, particularly in moments of reduced external stimulus, but these instances are brief and unstable. The dominant state is one of integration, where the host's sense of self is inseparable from their function as a living weapons platform. This progression from enhancement to obsession to subsumption is what defines the psychological horror of the Obliterator virus. It does not strip the host of their abilities, it refines and amplifies them, then redirects them until nothing remains but the function those abilities serve. The individual is not erased in a single moment. They are gradually redefined until their original identity becomes irrelevant to their continued existence. By the end of this stage, the host has become something that cannot be categorized within standard biological or psychological frameworks. They are neither fully organism nor fully machine, neither fully autonomous nor fully controlled. They are a hybrid entity whose body manufactures weapons, whose mind operates as a targeting system, and whose personality has been reshaped into a persistent drive toward combat integration. This sets the stage for the next phase of analysis, where the apparent advantages of this transformation are weighed against its destructive consequences, both for the individual and for any force that attempts to utilize or contain it. By the final stage of development, the transformation is no longer defined by instability alone. It produces measurable advantages that explain why the Obliterator virus persists, rather than being universally rejected, even among forces that understand its cost. These advantages are not theoretical. They are consistently observed across multiple accounts and are directly tied to the restructuring described in earlier stages. The infected host becomes one of the most adaptable battlefield assets available to chaos-aligned forces, and that utility cannot be dismissed. The most immediate gain is total weapons integration. An Obliterator does not carry armament in the conventional sense, it generates it. This removes one of the most limiting factors in warfare, which is dependency on supply chains. Ammunition is no longer required in the traditional form. Reloading is not necessary. Weapon switching does not involve discarding one system for another. Instead, the host can manifest different weapon profiles as required, adapting to target type, range, and environmental condition with minimal delay. This level of flexibility exceeds even the most advanced standardized loadouts used by the Imperium. Durability increases to a level that places the infected subject well beyond baseline Astartes resilience. The fusion of armor and flesh eliminates weak points that would normally exist at joints or structural seams. Damage is absorbed and redistributed across a body designed to function under extreme stress. Regenerative capacity, supported by the continuous restructuring of tissue, allows the host to recover from injuries that would permanently disable other combatants. This does not render the Obliterator invulnerable, but it significantly extends operational lifespan under sustained fire. Strength and mass contribute further to battlefield effectiveness. The host can support heavy weapon systems without external assistance, maintain firing stability, and resist recoil forces that would disrupt lesser units. Mobility, while altered, remains sufficient for repositioning, particularly in siege or close-range engagements, where raw firepower is prioritized over speed. In many cases, the Obliterator functions as a mobile heavy weapons platform capable of operating independently or in small groups without requiring the logistical support normally associated with such roles. Another advantage lies in environmental adaptability. The altered physiology reduces dependence on standard life support systems. Obliterators can operate in conditions that would be hostile or lethal to unmodified humans, including vacuum exposure for limited durations, toxic atmospheres, and extreme temperature ranges. This allows deployment in environments where conventional troops would require extensive preparation or would be unable to function at all. From a strategic perspective, the reduction of logistical burden is one of the most significant gains. Traditional armies rely on continuous supply lines to maintain ammunition, repair equipment, and replace damaged units. An Obliterator reduces or removes these requirements. It is self-sustaining in terms of armament and partially self-repairing in terms of structure. This makes it particularly valuable in prolonged engagements, isolated operations, or situations where supply lines are compromised. There is also a psychological component to these gains. The presence of an obliterator on the battlefield has a measurable effect on opposing forces. The visual and functional nature of the transformation creates uncertainty and fear. Standard tactical assumptions about ammunition limits, weapon capabilities, and damage thresholds no longer apply. This forces opponents to adapt in real time, often under pressure, which can degrade coordination and morale. However, these advantages are inseparable from the destructive outcomes that define the virus. The same processes that create adaptability and resilience also ensure that the host cannot return to a stable biological or psychological state. The transformation is not reversible. Once the integration reaches advanced stages, the original organism ceases to exist as an independent entity. The most immediate destructive outcome is the loss of identity. As described previously, personality is progressively overridden by the functional priorities imposed by the virus. What remains of the individual is reduced to a set of behaviors aligned with combat efficiency and system expansion. This is not a controlled sacrifice. It is an erosion that continues until there is no meaningful distinction between the host and the infection. Sanity degradation compounds this loss. While obliterators retain tactical awareness, their cognitive processes are no longer aligned with coherent long-term reasoning or stable social interaction. They are difficult to command, even by chaos standards. Coordination is possible, but it relies on shared objectives rather than disciplined hierarchy. This limits their usefulness in complex operations that require precise timing, communication, and restraint. Physical instability, while less apparent than in earlier stages, remains a factor. The body continues to evolve, and this evolution is not governed by a fixed blueprint. Growth can become excessive, leading to decreased mobility or structural imbalance. Weapon integration, while advantageous, can also result in inefficient configurations if the process is not guided or if the host absorbs incompatible systems. This creates variability in effectiveness, even among individuals classified under the same designation. Another destructive outcome is the risk of uncontrolled spread. The virus remains transmissible, and contact with infected individuals or contaminated materials poses a threat to nearby forces. This makes the presence of obliterators a liability in mixed unit deployments, particularly where uninfected troops are present. Containment becomes difficult once the infection is established, as the same resilience that makes the host effective in combat also makes them resistant to removal. From a logistical standpoint, while the obliterator reduces dependence on supply chains, it introduces new forms of unpredictability. The host's ability to generate weapons is not always consistent or fully understood. Output may vary based on internal state, environmental factors, or the nature of previously absorbed systems. This lack of standardization complicates planning and reduces the reliability that structured military forces depend on. The association with warp influence introduces an additional layer of risk. The infection is not purely physical, and its connection to the immaterial realm means that it can behave in ways that defy conventional prediction. This includes the potential for further mutation, interaction with demonic entities, or shifts in behavior that are not directly tied to observable stimuli. For forces attempting to utilize obliterators, this represents an ongoing hazard that cannot be fully mitigated. On a broader scale, the existence of the Obliterator virus represents a breakdown of boundaries that the Imperium relies on to maintain order. The distinction between man and machine, soldier and weapon, organism and tool is fundamental to Imperial doctrine. The virus erases these distinctions. It creates entities that cannot be categorized within existing frameworks, which complicates both understanding and response. For chaos-aligned forces, this breakdown is not inherently negative, but it still carries consequences. The same lack of boundaries that enables innovation also removes constraints. Without constraints, control becomes more difficult. Obliterators are powerful assets, but they are not stable ones. Their continued existence depends on a balance between utility and risk that is constantly shifting. In conclusion, The Obliterator Virus can be understood as both a weapon and a warning. It offers clear, tangible gains in terms of firepower, resilience, and independence from logistical support. These gains explain its persistence and its appeal within certain factions. At the same time, it ensures the destruction of the individual host, the erosion of command structures, and the introduction of uncontrollable variables into any force that employs it. It does not create soldiers, it creates systems that happen to have once been soldiers. The transformation replaces identity with function, stability with adaptation, and control with continuous change. In doing so, it exemplifies a broader pattern within the Warhammer 40,000 setting, where the pursuit of power through integration with the warp and forbidden technology leads not to mastery, but to a state where the distinction between user and tool no longer exists. This completes the foundational overview of the Obliterator Virus within a strictly law-based framework. The following chapter will shift perspective, examining documented observations, interpretations, and possible applications from the standpoint of Imperial institutions and Mechanicus analysis, including both confirmed records and contested interpretations. Imperial records that reference the Obliterator Virus do not begin as formalized doctrine. They begin as fragmented observations, often appended to after-action reports where standard classification systems proved insufficient. Administratum scribes, tasked with converting battlefield accounts into structured data, repeatedly encountered descriptions that did not align with known categories of Heertech constructs, demon engines, or biological abominations. The early pattern across these reports is not clarity but administrative friction. Entries are corrected, refiled, or cross-referenced multiple times before settling into a provisional designation. What emerges from this process is not a clean definition, but a consensus that the phenomenon represents a convergence of multiple threat types. From the perspective of the Adeptus Administratum, the primary concern is classification and predictability. The Imperium functions through documentation, standardization, and the ability to assign known responses to known threats. The Obliterator Virus disrupts this system at every level. Reports describe entities that do not conform to expected limits of ammunition, do not degrade at predictable rates under sustained fire, and do not require resupply. This creates inconsistencies in engagement data. Casualty projections fail. Ammunition expenditure estimates become unreliable. Standard engagement durations no longer apply when facing a unit that can sustain continuous output without logistical interruption. Administratum analysts note a recurring issue in compiled reports. Units encountering obliterators often misidentify them during initial contact. They are classified as heavy weapons teams, demon engines, or corrupted Astartes depending on visible characteristics. Only after extended engagement does the distinction become clear. This delay in accurate identification contributes directly to increased losses, as tactical responses are based on incorrect assumptions. The inability to immediately categorize the threat is itself recorded as a significant factor in battlefield inefficiency. Another consistent observation concerns the breakdown of supply-based modeling. Imperial doctrine assumes that all hostile forces operate within some form of logistical constraint, whether material or warp-derived. The Obliterator Virus challenges this assumption by producing entities that appear to generate their own armament indefinitely within operational timeframes. Administratum records do not claim true infinite output, but they consistently note that observed engagement durations exceed what would be possible under standard supply limitations. This forces a re-evaluation of attrition-based strategies, particularly in prolonged engagements. The Adeptus Mechanicus approaches the same phenomenon from a different analytical framework. Where the Administratum seeks categorization, the Mechanicus seeks underlying principle. Their observations focus less on the inconsistency of reports and more on identifying the processes that produce the observed effects. Initial Mechanicus assessments classify the Obliterator Virus as a form of techno-organic integration influenced by warp energies. This classification is not definitive but serves as a working model for further analysis. Mechanicus logs emphasize the absence of clear boundaries between biological and mechanical systems in infected subjects. Standard machine integration relies on defined interfaces, where biological tissue connects to mechanical components through engineered junctions. In Obliterators, these junctions are either absent or constantly shifting. Flesh and metal are not connected, they are continuous. This continuity suggests that the infection does not merely attach machinery to the host, but converts both host and machinery into a unified substrate. Observations of weapon manifestation are of particular interest. Mechanicus observers note that the generated weapons often resemble known patterns, including bolters, plasma-based systems, and other recognizable armaments. However, these manifestations do not always adhere to exact specifications. Variations in design, output, and efficiency are recorded. This suggests that the Obliterator does not store exact templates of absorbed weapons, but rather internalizes functional principles. The host reproduces the effect of the weapon rather than the precise structure. This distinction is significant. It implies a level of adaptive fabrication that exceeds conventional manufacturing processes. The Obliterator does not require raw materials in the traditional sense, nor does it rely on fixed schematics. Instead, it appears to convert internal mass and external energy into functional weapon systems based on prior exposure. Mechanicus records do not provide a complete explanation for this process, but they consistently describe it as a form of continuous reconfiguration, driven by both biological and warp influence factors. Another notable finding concerns self-repair. Mechanicus observers document instances where damage to an Obliterator is followed by rapid restructuring of surrounding tissue and integrated systems. This repair is not uniform. In some cases, the repaired area differs structurally from its previous state, incorporating elements of previously absorbed weapon systems. This suggests that repair and adaptation are linked processes. The host does not restore itself to a prior configuration, but evolves in response to damage. The Mechanicus also records irregular energy signatures associated with Obliterator activity. These signatures do not match standard power sources used in Imperial or even known Heretic machinery. Instead, they display fluctuations consistent with warp interaction. This supports the conclusion that the virus operates at the intersection of physical and immaterial systems. The host is not solely generating energy through biological or mechanical means. It is drawing from a source that cannot be fully quantified within conventional frameworks. From a combined Administratum and Mechanicus perspective, one of the most concerning observations is the potential for spread beyond initial points of origin. Reports from regions affected by large-scale chaos incursions indicate that the virus can persist in contaminated environments. Salvage operations, battlefield recovery efforts, and contact with infected remains all present transmission risks. This complicates post-engagement procedures, as standard decontamination protocols may not be sufficient to neutralize the threat. Administratum directives in response to these findings emphasize containment and controlled engagement. Units are instructed to avoid prolonged contact with infected entities and to limit exposure to contaminated materials. However, the effectiveness of these directives is inconsistent, particularly in high-intensity combat zones where adherence to protocol is difficult to maintain. Mechanicus advisories reinforce these concerns, noting that improper handling of infected material can lead to unintended integration or secondary outbreaks. There are also recorded instances of attempted study. Mechanicus factions, particularly those operating near the boundaries of accepted doctrine, have shown interest in isolating and analysing the virus. These efforts are not uniformly sanctioned and often exist in tension with broader imperial policy. The potential applications of a system capable of self-generating armament and integrating seamlessly with biological hosts are evident. At the same time, the risks associated with uncontrolled spread and warp influence make such research highly contentious. Notable findings from these studies remain limited and often incomplete. In cases where samples are successfully contained, they exhibit instability outside of a host environment. This suggests that the virus requires an active biological and possibly neurological system to sustain its processes. Attempts to replicate its effects through purely mechanical means have not produced comparable results, reinforcing the conclusion that the Obliterator virus cannot be reduced to a simple technological artifact. Across all compiled observations, a consistent theme emerges. The Obliterator virus represents a system that defies the Imperium's foundational assumptions about the separation of categories. It is not purely a disease, not purely a machine, and not purely a warp phenomenon. It is a convergence of all three, operating in a manner that resists full analysis. Administratum records reflect this through repeated revisions and cross-references, while Mechanicus logs reflect it through provisional classifications and ongoing study. Neither institution claims complete understanding. Instead, they document what can be observed, identify patterns where possible, and acknowledge the limits of their frameworks. These impressions and observations form the basis for further analysis within imperial institutions. They do not provide a solution to the problem, but they establish the parameters within which the problem must be addressed. The Obliterator virus is recognized not only as a battlefield threat, but as a systemic anomaly that challenges the Imperium's ability to categorize, predict, and control the forces it encounters. This perspective leads directly into the next phase of examination, where the focus shifts from observation to application. Imperial and Mechanicus records begin to explore how the properties of the virus might influence strategy, logistics, and morale, as well as the potential and risks of attempting to utilize or counteract its effects within structured military operations. Imperial records that transition from observation into application do so with a level of restraint that reflects both caution and necessity. The Adeptus Administratum does not approach the Obliterator virus as a tool to be adopted, but as a variable that must be accounted for in operational planning. The Adeptus Mechanicus, by contrast, frames the same phenomenon as a subject of conditional utility, provided it can be understood, contained, or replicated in controlled forms. The difference between these perspectives defines much of the tension within the documented material. From a strategic standpoint, the most immediate implication is the removal of conventional supply dependencies. Administratum analysts note that any force-fielding Obliterator-class entities operates outside the expected logistical model. Ammunition tracking becomes irrelevant. Resupply intervals cannot be used to predict engagement windows. Standard doctrines that rely on exhausting an enemy's resources lose effectiveness. This forces a shift toward alternative strategies, emphasizing overwhelming force, rapid neutralization, or avoidance rather than attritional engagement. The Administratum does not treat this as an advantage to be mirrored, but as a disruption to be countered. Recommended adjustments include increased allocation of heavy ordnance, prioritization of long-range engagement, and avoidance of prolonged direct contact. Engagement reports suggest that units which attempt to match sustained fire output with Obliterators suffer disproportionate losses. Instead, success rates improve when engagements are structured to minimize exposure time and maximize concentrated damage within narrow windows. At the same time, Administratum projections acknowledge a theoretical advantage if similar capabilities could be harnessed under Imperial control. The concept of a self-sustaining weapons platform aligns with the Imperium's need to maintain extended campaigns across vast distances. Supply lines are one of the most vulnerable aspects of Imperial warfare. A unit that does not require ammunition or standard maintenance would reduce strain on transport fleets, storage facilities, and logistical coordination. However, these projections remain hypothetical and are consistently accompanied by cautionary notes regarding the uncontrollable nature of the virus. The Adeptus Mechanicus approaches this potential more directly. Within certain factions, there is recorded interest in isolating the underlying principles that allow for continuous weapon generation and integration. Mechanicus terminology frames this as a form of adaptive fabrication, where the host acts as both forge and output system. The appeal is clear. A system that can internalize weapon patterns and reproduce them without external manufacturing would represent a significant advancement in efficiency. However, Mechanicus records also emphasize the limitations of current understanding. Attempts to replicate these effects through purely mechanical constructs have not achieved comparable results. Standard servitors and automata lack the adaptive complexity required to sustain such processes. This reinforces the conclusion that the biological component is not incidental but essential. The virus relies on a living host to mediate the interaction between physical matter and warp influence. Some Mechanicus logs speculate on the possibility of controlled integration, where elements of the Obliterator process could be adapted without full exposure to the virus. These speculations are not presented as confirmed outcomes. They are theoretical frameworks, often marked by phrases indicating uncertainty. It is believed that partial replication might be achievable through advanced cybernetic augmentation combined with restricted warp interaction. It is also noted that such efforts would require a level of experimentation that approaches or exceeds established boundaries of acceptable doctrine. Strategically, the presence of Obliterators alters battlefield planning beyond simple engagement tactics. Administratum planners must account for the psychological and structural impact on both friendly and enemy forces. The unpredictability of the virus introduces variables that cannot be easily modelled. This affects not only direct combat scenarios, but also broader campaign planning, where the potential appearance of Obliterator units can disrupt established timelines and resource allocation. This perspective leads directly into the next phase of examination, where the focus shifts from observation to application. Imperial and Mechanicus records begin to explore how the properties of the virus might influence strategy, logistics, and morale, as well as the potential and risks of attempting to utilize or counteract its effects within structured military operations. Imperial records that transition from observation into application do so with a level of restraint that reflects both caution and necessity. The Adeptus Administratum does not approach the Obliterator virus as a tool to be adopted, but as a variable that must be accounted for in operational planning. The Adeptus Mechanicus, by contrast, frames the same phenomenon as a subject of conditional utility, provided it can be understood, contained, or replicated in controlled forms. The difference between these perspectives defines much of the tension within the documented material. From a strategic standpoint, the most immediate implication is the removal of conventional supply dependencies. Administratum analysts note that any force-fielding Obliterator-class entities operates outside the expected logistical model. Ammunition tracking becomes irrelevant. Resupply intervals cannot be used to predict engagement windows. Standard doctrines that rely on exhausting an enemy's resources lose effectiveness. This forces a shift toward alternative strategies, emphasizing overwhelming force, rapid neutralization, or avoidance rather than attritional engagement. The Administratum does not treat this as an advantage to be mirrored, but as a disruption to be countered. Recommended adjustments include increased allocation of heavy ordnance, prioritization of long-range engagement, and avoidance of prolonged direct contact. Engagement reports suggest that units which attempt to match sustained fire output with Obliterators suffer disproportionate losses. Instead, success rates improve when engagements are structured to minimize exposure time and maximize concentrated damage within narrow windows. At the same time, Administratum projections acknowledge a theoretical advantage if similar capabilities could be harnessed under Imperial control. The concept of a self-sustaining weapons platform aligns with the Imperium's need to maintain extended campaigns across vast distances. Supply lines are one of the most vulnerable aspects of Imperial warfare. A unit that does not require ammunition or standard maintenance would reduce strain on transport fleets, storage facilities, and logistical coordination. However, these projections remain hypothetical and are consistently accompanied by cautionary notes regarding the uncontrollable nature of the virus. The Adeptus Mechanicus approaches this potential more directly. Within certain factions, there is recorded interest in isolating the underlying principles that allow for continuous weapon generation and integration. Mechanicus terminology frames this as a form of adaptive fabrication, where the host acts as both forge and output system. The appeal is clear. A system that can internalize weapon patterns and reproduce them without external manufacturing would represent a significant advancement in efficiency. However, Mechanicus records also emphasize the limitations of current understanding. Attempts to replicate these effects through purely mechanical constructs have not achieved comparable results. Standard servitors and automata lack the adaptive complexity required to sustain such processes. This reinforces the conclusion that the biological component is not incidental but essential. The virus relies on a living host to mediate the interaction between physical matter and warp influence. Some Mechanicus logs speculate on the possibility of controlled integration, where elements of the Obliterator process could be adapted without full exposure to the virus. These speculations are not presented as confirmed outcomes. They are theoretical frameworks, often marked by phrases indicating uncertainty. It is believed that partial replication might be achievable through advanced cybernetic augmentation combined with restricted warp interaction. It is also noted that such efforts would require a level of experimentation that approaches or exceeds established boundaries of acceptable doctrine. Strategically, the presence of Obliterators alters battlefield planning beyond simple engagement tactics. Administratum planners must account for the psychological and structural impact on both friendly and enemy forces. The unpredictability of the virus introduces variables that cannot be easily modelled. This affects not only direct combat scenarios, but also broader campaign planning, where the potential appearance of Obliterator units can disrupt established timelines and resource allocation. Effects on morale are consistently documented across multiple reports. For Imperial forces, the encounter with Obliterators produces a distinct form of psychological stress. Unlike conventional enemies, these entities do not behave within expected parameters. The absence of visible ammunition limits, combined with the regenerative nature of their bodies, creates a perception of invulnerability. This perception, whether accurate or not, influences soldier behavior. Units may hesitate, overcommit resources, or withdraw prematurely in response to the perceived threat. Administratum records note that morale degradation is particularly pronounced in units with limited prior exposure to Chaos forces. Veterans show greater resilience, likely due to familiarity with other forms of corruption that defy standard logic. Even so, prolonged engagement with Obliterators is associated with increased rates of fatigue, stress responses, and breakdown of unit cohesion. The visual aspect of the transformation, where flesh and weapon are indistinguishable, contributes to this effect by reinforcing the sense that the enemy is fundamentally outside the bounds of normal warfare. From the perspective of Chaos-aligned forces, the effect on morale is inverted but not uniformly positive. The presence of Obliterators can serve as a demonstration of power, reinforcing the perceived strength of Chaos and the rewards of transformation. This can increase aggression and commitment among allied units. At the same time, there are indications that not all Chaos forces are comfortable operating alongside Obliterators. The risk of infection and the unpredictable nature of the entities create a level of unease even among those aligned with similar ideologies. Mechanicus observations add another dimension to morale analysis. Within their own ranks, the existence of the Obliterator virus challenges established beliefs about the proper relationship between flesh and machine. For orthodox factions, the uncontrolled fusion represented by the virus is viewed as a corruption of sacred principles. For more radical elements, it represents a potential evolution, albeit one that is currently beyond their ability to control. This division influences how different Mechanicus groups respond to reports of Obliterator activity, ranging from strict avoidance to covert interest. Logistical effects extend beyond the immediate advantages or disruptions associated with the virus. The presence of Obliterators complicates supply chain management for both sides of a conflict. For Imperial forces, increased ammunition expenditure during engagements with Obliterators places additional strain on already extended supply lines. Heavy ordnance, which is more effective against such targets, is typically limited in availability. This creates a mismatch between required and available resources, forcing commanders to make difficult allocation decisions. Medical and recovery logistics are also affected. Standard battlefield recovery procedures become hazardous when dealing with potential Obliterator contamination. Injured personnel exposed to infected entities may require isolation or termination to prevent spread. This increases the burden on medical units and reduces overall recovery rates. Administratum directives often recommend the destruction of contaminated equipment rather than attempted salvage, leading to further material loss. For Chaos forces, the logistical picture is more complex. On one hand, Obliterators reduce the need for conventional supply chains, particularly in terms of ammunition and certain forms of maintenance. On the other hand, their unpredictability and the risk of uncontrolled spread introduce new challenges. Units must account for the possibility that Obliterators will act outside of planned parameters, or that their presence will compromise nearby forces. This creates a different kind of logistical burden, focused less on material supply and more on risk management. Mechanicus records also highlight the difficulty of integrating Obliterators into structured deployment frameworks. Unlike standard units, they cannot be easily assigned fixed roles based on known capabilities. Their adaptability makes them versatile, but it also makes them difficult to plan around. Command structures that rely on predictable unit behavior find it challenging to incorporate entities whose output and configuration can change during engagement. Across all perspectives, the Obliterator Virus introduces a form of asymmetry that disrupts established systems. It offers clear advantages in terms of self-sufficiency and adaptability, but these advantages are offset by instability, risk, and the erosion of control. The Administratum responds by adjusting doctrine to mitigate these effects, while the Mechanicus continues to explore the underlying principles with cautious interest. The combined analysis does not resolve the tension between potential utility and inherent danger. Instead, it defines the boundaries within which the virus can be understood and responded to. It is recognized as a factor that cannot be ignored, a capability that cannot be easily replicated, and a threat that cannot be fully contained through conventional means. This framework leads into the next stage of documentation, where specific battlefield cases and recorded engagements provide concrete examples of how these strategic, logistical, and psychological factors manifest under real combat conditions. Administratum archives that catalogue battlefield encounters with Obliterator-class entities are structured around outcomes rather than narrative. Individual engagements are recorded, cross-referenced, and compared against standard operational expectations. Across these records, a pattern emerges in which the presence of even a small number of Obliterators produces disproportionate disruption relative to their numerical strength. This effect is consistent across multiple theatres, including siege environments, urban conflict zones, and open field engagements. In siege conditions, Obliterators are repeatedly documented as force multipliers. Their ability to generate sustained heavy fire without resupply allows them to maintain pressure on fortified positions over extended periods. Administratum reports note that traditional defensive calculations, which assume eventual reduction in enemy fire due to ammunition constraints, do not apply. Instead, defenders face continuous bombardment that degrades structural integrity and morale simultaneously. In several recorded cases, fortifications designed to withstand prolonged siege conditions failed earlier than projected due to the uninterrupted output of Obliterator units. Mechanicus observers attached to these engagements focus on the interaction between Obliterator-generated weapon systems and defensive structures. Their logs describe variations in output that adapt to target resistance. When encountering heavily reinforced materials, Obliterators are observed manifesting higher energy discharge patterns or heavier projectile configurations. This suggests a responsive adaptation mechanism rather than fixed capability. The implication is that defensive design alone cannot guarantee resistance, as the attacking system evolves in response to encountered materials. Urban combat provides a different set of observations. Administratum records indicate that Obliterators operate effectively in dense environments where line of sight is limited and engagement ranges fluctuate rapidly. Their integrated weapon systems allow for immediate response to emerging threats without the need to reposition or rearm. This reduces the effectiveness of ambush tactics, which rely on exploiting moments of vulnerability during reload or weapon transition. Units attempting close-quarters engagement often experience severe losses due to the Obliterator's ability to generate appropriate weapon configurations at minimal distance. Mechanicus' analysis of urban engagements highlights the role of environmental interaction. Obliterators are documented absorbing or integrating elements from their surroundings, including damaged machinery and abandoned weapon systems. While not all reports confirm successful integration of large-scale infrastructure, there is sufficient evidence to suggest that the presence of accessible material increases the variability of their output. This reinforces the classification of the host as an adaptive system, rather than a fixed platform. Open field engagements present fewer environmental variables, but still demonstrate the same core characteristics. Administratum data shows that Obliterators function as mobile heavy support units, capable of anchoring advancing forces or providing covering fire during retreats. Their resilience allows them to absorb incoming fire that would otherwise target more vulnerable units. In several cases, Obliterators are positioned at key points within a formation, effectively serving as both offensive and defensive assets. One notable pattern across multiple engagements is the difficulty of neutralization. Administratum reports consistently indicate that standard infantry weapons are insufficient against Obliterator-class targets. Effective engagement requires heavy ordnance, concentrated fire, or specialized anti-armor weaponry. Even under these conditions, success is not guaranteed. The regenerative properties of the host, combined with its mass and integrated armor, extend the time required to achieve a confirmed kill. This increases exposure for attacking units and raises overall casualty rates. Mechanicus logs supplement these findings with observations on damage response. When subjected to high-intensity fire, Obliterators do not simply absorb damage, they adapt to it. In some recorded instances, areas that sustained repeated hits exhibit structural changes that reduce vulnerability to similar attacks. This suggests a feedback mechanism in which the host modifies its composition in response to incoming threats. While not instantaneous, this adaptation occurs within the time frame of a single engagement, further complicating attempts at neutralization. There are also documented cases of containment failure. Administratum records include instances where attempts to isolate or capture infected subjects resulted in secondary spread. Recovery teams, operating under standard protocols, made contact with contaminated material or directly with the host, leading to subsequent infection. These cases reinforce earlier conclusions regarding transmission risk and highlight the inadequacy of conventional containment procedures when applied to this specific threat. In engagements where Obliterators are deployed alongside other Chaos forces, coordination varies. Some reports describe effective integration within broader assault patterns, where Obliterators provide sustained fire support while other units advance. In these cases, their presence enhances overall combat effectiveness and accelerates objective completion. Other reports note a lack of coordination, where Obliterators operate independently or deviate from planned movements. This inconsistency reflects the previously documented limitations in command and control. Mechanicus observers attribute this variability to the neurological and warp-influenced aspects of the infection. The host retains tactical awareness, but does not consistently adhere to external command structures. This results in behavior that can align with strategic objectives without being directly controlled. From a systems perspective, Obliterators function as semi-autonomous units whose actions are guided by internal priorities rather than strict command input. A smaller subset of records includes references to unusual interactions with other forms of technology. In these cases, Obliterators are observed interfacing with or disrupting nearby systems, including vehicles and automated defenses. The extent and reliability of this interaction are not fully documented, and some reports remain inconclusive. Mechanicus analysts treat these findings with caution, noting that while the virus demonstrates broad integration capabilities, not all forms of machinery are equally susceptible. The cumulative results of these battlefield cases lead to several consistent conclusions within Administratum documentation. First, Obliterators represent a high-threat classification, that requires immediate prioritization upon identification. Second, engagement strategies must account for their sustained output and resilience, avoiding prolonged exposure whenever possible. Third, containment and recovery procedures must be adjusted to address transmission risk, with an emphasis on minimizing contact and eliminating contaminated materials. From the Mechanicus perspective, the results reinforce the classification of the Obliterator virus as a hybrid system operating beyond conventional technological or biological limits. Its ability to adapt, integrate, and sustain itself under combat conditions confirms that it cannot be replicated through standard engineering approaches. At the same time, its consistent behaviors across multiple hosts suggest underlying principles that, if understood, could inform future developments. It is also noted that despite extensive observation, no definitive method of control or reversal has been identified. All recorded attempts to isolate the virus from its host or to stabilize its effects outside of a living system have failed to produce viable results. This limits the potential for direct application and reinforces the need for continued study under controlled conditions. In conclusion, the battlefield record of the Obliterator virus supports its classification as both a strategic asset and a systemic threat. Its advantages in firepower, resilience, and self-sufficiency are consistently demonstrated across diverse combat environments. These advantages are offset by unpredictability, transmission risk, and the erosion of command structures. The Adeptus Administratum responds by adapting doctrine to mitigate these effects, while the Adeptus Mechanicus continues to analyze the underlying mechanisms with the goal of extracting usable knowledge. The combined findings do not resolve the inherent contradiction between utility and danger. Instead, they establish a framework in which the Obliterator virus is understood as a phenomenon that must be managed rather than mastered. Its presence on the battlefield alters the conditions of engagement in ways that cannot be fully predicted or controlled, ensuring that any force encountering it must operate outside the assumptions that govern conventional warfare. This completes the Administratum and Mechanicus examination. The next chapter will shift perspective to Inquisition archives, where the focus expands to include suppressed records, interrogative findings, and speculative interpretations that extend beyond officially sanctioned doctrine. Inquisition records do not begin with classification, they begin with suspicion. Where the Adeptus Administratum seeks structure and the Adeptus Mechanicus seeks principle, the Inquisition begins with the assumption that incomplete information is itself a form of concealment. Early references to the Obliterator virus within inquisitorial archives appear not as confirmed entries, but as flagged inconsistencies. Reports are marked for review not because they are understood, but because they do not align with expected patterns of corruption, mutation, or heretic activity. Initial impressions within these archives reflect a recurring concern. The phenomenon is not behaving like a singular origin threat. Instead, it appears in multiple regions across different warbands and with varying characteristics that suggest divergence rather than uniform spread. This leads to early speculation that the virus is either evolving independently in separate locations or that multiple strains exist, each adapted to specific conditions or hosts. This remains unconfirmed, but the pattern is noted consistently enough to warrant continued attention. Inquisitorial observers also record a discrepancy between observed capability and documented origin. Standard chaos corruptions tend to carry identifiable signatures, whether aligned with specific warp entities, cult structures, or known heretic practices. The Obliterator virus does not consistently present such markers. In some cases, it is associated with Nurgle-aligned forces. In others, it appears within Iron Warriors formations or in proximity to Dark Mechanicum activity. There are also isolated reports where no clear affiliation is present at all. This lack of consistent alignment raises the possibility that the virus is not bound to a single source of corruption. From this point, Inquisition records begin to branch into competing lines of interpretation. One line suggests that the virus is not a natural development within the warp but a constructed system that has achieved self-propagation. Under this interpretation, the original creator, whether an individual such as Fabius Bile, or a faction within the Dark Mechanicum, may no longer have control over its spread. The virus continues to operate and evolve independently, using hosts as both carriers and platforms for further development. Another line of speculation considers the possibility that the virus is not a single entity, but a category of related phenomena. In this view, what is identified as the Obliterator Virus may represent a convergence point where multiple forms of techno-organic corruption produce similar outcomes. This would explain the variation in observed behavior and the absence of a consistent origin signature. It would also imply that efforts to contain or eradicate the virus as a single threat may be inherently flawed. There are also records that treat the virus as a form of possession rather than infection. These accounts emphasize the role of warp entities in shaping the transformation, suggesting that the host is being used as a vessel for a form of demonic intelligence that expresses itself through weapon integration. This interpretation is not widely accepted within inquisitorial consensus, but it persists in certain reports, particularly those involving extreme or atypical manifestations. Observations gathered from interrogations and field investigations contribute further complexity. Infected individuals, when encountered in early or mid stages of transformation, display inconsistent awareness of their condition. Some acknowledge changes but do not recognize them as corruption. Others exhibit fragmented understanding, describing the integration of weapons as a form of improvement or necessity. There are rare instances where subjects express resistance or fear, but these are typically short-lived as the infection progresses. Inquisition analysts note that the virus appears to exploit both physical and psychological vulnerabilities. Hosts with strong identification as warriors or engineers show a higher likelihood of accepting early-stage changes. This acceptance may accelerate progression, as resistance mechanisms are either suppressed or never fully engaged. Conversely, individuals with less attachment to combat roles may exhibit stronger initial resistance, though this does not guarantee immunity. A recurring observation concerns the role of proximity to advanced weaponry and machinery. Infected subjects demonstrate increased activity when in contact with such materials, suggesting that the environment influences the rate and direction of development. This has led to the hypothesis that the virus is not only host-dependent, but also context-dependent, adapting its expression based on available resources. This remains a working theory rather than a confirmed mechanism. Conspiracy findings within Inquisition archives are presented with explicit caution. They are not treated as verified fact, but as possibilities that warrant monitoring. One such finding suggests that certain Chaos factions may be deliberately cultivating the virus, not merely as a weapon, but as a means of reshaping their forces. Under this theory, Obliterators are not accidental outcomes, but intentional endpoints, representing a form of evolution aligned with Chaos doctrine. Another speculation proposes that the virus may have already spread further into the Imperium than official records indicate. This is based on discrepancies between reported encounters and confirmed cases. In some regions, there are reports of anomalous weapon behavior, unexplained integration of machinery with biological hosts, or sudden increases in combat efficiency among otherwise standard units. These incidents are not always classified under the Obliterator designation, but inquisitorial analysts note similarities that suggest a possible connection. There are also references to suppressed Mechanicus research. Certain Inquisition files indicate that elements within the Adeptus Mechanicus may have attempted to study or replicate aspects of the virus beyond officially sanctioned limits. These efforts are not fully documented, and many records are incomplete or redacted. The implication is not that the Mechanicus has succeeded in controlling the virus, but that the boundary between study and experimentation may have been crossed in isolated cases. A more speculative line of inquiry considers the possibility that the virus represents an early stage of a broader transformation. In this view, the Obliterator is not the final form but a transitional state. The integration of flesh and weapon is seen as a step toward a more complete convergence of biology, technology, and warp influence. This theory is not supported by concrete evidence, but it appears in multiple independent records, suggesting that it has gained some level of traction among inquisitorial analysts. Despite the range of interpretations, certain conclusions remain consistent. The Obliterator virus is not fully understood. Its origin is unclear, its mechanisms are only partially mapped, and its long-term trajectory is unknown. These gaps in knowledge are treated as critical vulnerabilities. The Inquisition does not assume that the current manifestation represents the limit of the virus's capabilities. Observational protocols within the Inquisition reflect this uncertainty. Encounters with Obliterator-class entities are flagged for immediate review, and all associated data is subject to cross-analysis. Investigations prioritize not only the immediate threat but also the conditions under which it emerged. This includes examination of local populations, technological infrastructure, and any evidence of prior chaos activity. Containment strategies within inquisitorial doctrine emphasize elimination over study. While the Mechanicus may seek to understand, the Inquisition prioritizes removal of the threat. This approach is based on the assessment that the risks associated with further spread outweigh the potential benefits of deeper analysis. Exceptions to this policy exist but are tightly controlled and often classified at the highest levels. In summary, the Inquisition's impression of the Obliterator virus is defined by uncertainty and caution. Observations confirm its adaptability, its capacity for spread, and its resistance to conventional classification. Conspiracy findings expand the scope of concern, introducing the possibility of multiple origins, intentional cultivation, and deeper infiltration into Imperial systems. These records do not provide definitive answers. Instead, they map the boundaries of what is known and highlight the areas where knowledge is incomplete. The Obliterator virus is treated not as a solved problem, but as an evolving threat, one that may already be operating beyond the limits of current detection and understanding. This perspective establishes the foundation for further inquiry, where interrogation records, anomaly reports, and direct encounters provide additional detail on how the virus behaves under scrutiny and how it interacts with those who attempt to study or resist it. Inquisition. Interrogative records concerning the Obliterator virus are limited in number and inconsistent in quality. This is not due to lack of interest, but due to the practical difficulty of securing viable subjects. Most infected individuals reach advanced stages of transformation before capture is possible, at which point communication becomes fragmented or non-functional. As a result, the majority of usable data is drawn from early to mid-stage subjects, partial recoveries, or indirect testimony from witnesses and surviving personnel. Where interrogation is possible, a pattern emerges in how infected subjects describe their condition. Early-stage individuals rarely identify the changes as pathological. Instead, they report an increased sense of efficiency and alignment with their equipment. Weapons are described as feeling correct or complete in the hand. This language appears across multiple interrogations, suggesting a shared cognitive shift rather than isolated perception. The subject does not feel augmented in a foreign way. They feel optimized. As questioning continues, this perception begins to change. Subjects in mid-stage transformation often express awareness that something is wrong, but their ability to articulate the problem is impaired. Descriptions become inconsistent. Some report hearing internal signals or impulses that guide their interaction with machinery. Others describe an absence rather than a presence, noting that hesitation, doubt, or restraint no longer occur. This absence is not initially recognized as loss. It is interpreted as clarity. Inquisitors record that resistance, when it occurs, is typically brief. Subjects who attempt to reject the integration process exhibit signs of cognitive stress, including disorientation and loss of coordination. In several cases, this resistance is followed by rapid progression of physical symptoms, suggesting that opposition to the process may accelerate its effects. This observation is not confirmed as a rule, but it is noted frequently enough to influence containment protocols. Interrogative findings also include attempts to isolate the source of perceived guidance within infected subjects. When asked directly whether their actions are self-directed, responses vary. Some subjects insist that they remain in control even when describing behaviours that contradict this claim. Others acknowledge an external influence but cannot define it clearly. Terms such as pressure, instruction, or presence appear in transcripts, but none are used consistently enough to establish a definitive pattern. A smaller number of interrogations involve subjects who exhibit higher levels of coherence despite advanced infection. These individuals are rare and often associated with prior roles that required technical or strategic expertise, such as tech marines or specialized operators. In these cases, the subject may retain the ability to describe their condition in more structured terms. They acknowledge the integration of weapon systems and the alteration of their body, but they do not frame it as loss. Instead, they present it as an evolution or improvement, even when confronted with evidence of deterioration. Inquisitors note that these subjects are more difficult to assess. Their responses are internally consistent, and they demonstrate awareness of their environment and the interrogation process. However, their value systems have shifted to align with the objectives of the virus. This creates a form of rationality that is functional, but incompatible with baseline human or imperial standards. The subject is not delusional in the traditional sense. They are operating under a different set of priorities. Anomalies within interrogative records are of particular interest. These include instances where subjects display knowledge or capabilities that exceed their prior experience. In one documented case, an infected individual demonstrated familiarity with weapon systems that were not present in their immediate environment and for which they had no recorded training. This suggests that the virus may carry or access a form of cumulative knowledge related to weapon function. Another anomaly involves temporal inconsistency in symptom progression. While the stage model of development is widely accepted, there are recorded cases where subjects appear to skip intermediate phases or exhibit advanced capabilities earlier than expected. These deviations are not fully explained. Some inquisitorial analysts propose that environmental factors, such as proximity to warp disturbances or exposure to advanced machinery, may influence the rate of progression. Others suggest that individual differences in physiology or psychology may play a role. There are also reports of partial stabilization. In these cases, subjects reach a certain level of integration and then exhibit minimal further change over extended periods. This does not indicate recovery or control. The subject remains fully corrupted, but the rate of transformation slows. These instances are rare and often associated with highly controlled environments or limited access to new material for integration. The significance of this phenomenon remains unclear, but it raises the possibility that progression is not always continuous. Personal encounters documented by inquisitors and their retinues provide additional context that formal interrogation cannot capture. These accounts are typically recorded after engagement, when direct communication is no longer possible. They focus on behaviour, interaction, and the subjective experience of encountering an Obliterator class entity. One consistent observation is the absence of hesitation. Obliterators do not pause to assess in the way that uninfected combatants do. Their responses are immediate and proportional to perceived threat. This creates an impression of inevitability, as if the entity is not deciding but executing a predetermined function. Inquisitors note that this behavior differs from other Chaos entities, which may display aggression, unpredictability, or even theatricality. Obliterators are described as direct and efficient. Another recurring detail is the way in which Obliterators interact with their environment. In personal accounts, Inquisitors describe instances where nearby weapons or machinery appear to influence the entity's configuration. This is not always visible as a discrete action. Instead, it manifests as a gradual change in form or capability over the course of an encounter. Observers report that the entity seems to learn from its surroundings, though this term is used cautiously. Close-range encounters provide the most detailed observations but also carry the highest risk. In these situations, Inquisitors and their retinues are exposed to the full range of the entity's capabilities, including its regenerative properties and adaptive weapon systems. Reports emphasize the difficulty of maintaining standard engagement protocols under these conditions. The combination of physical resilience, continuous output, and unpredictable adaptation forces rapid adjustments that can exceed the capacity of even experienced personnel. There are also accounts of attempted communication during combat. In rare instances, Inquisitors have attempted to engage Obliterators verbally, either to assess residual consciousness or to provoke a response. Results are inconsistent. Some entities show no reaction, continuing their actions without acknowledgement. Others exhibit brief pauses or changes in behavior, though these are not sustained. In a few cases, fragmented speech is reported, often consisting of single words or short phrases related to weapons or function. These occurrences are not common and do not provide reliable data, but they are recorded as evidence that some level of cognitive processing remains. An additional anomaly noted in personal encounters is the apparent resistance of some Obliterators to certain forms of psychic influence. While not immune, these entities may demonstrate reduced susceptibility to techniques that would affect other corrupted or warp-aligned beings. The reasons for this are not fully understood. It is possible that the integration of biological, mechanical, and warp elements creates a form of internal stability that resists external manipulation. This remains speculative and is not uniformly observed. Across all interrogative findings, anomalies, and personal accounts, the Inquisition maintains a consistent position. The Obliterator virus represents a threat that cannot be fully understood through standard investigative methods. Interrogation yields partial insight, but is limited by the progression of the infection. Anomalies provide clues, but do not resolve underlying questions. Personal encounters offer valuable observation, but are constrained by the conditions of combat. The cumulative effect of these records is not clarity, but a narrowing of uncertainty. The Inquisition identifies patterns, flags deviations, and adjusts protocols based on observed behavior. It does not claim to have identified the source, the full mechanism, or the ultimate trajectory of the virus. This body of evidence sets the stage for the final segment of analysis, where classified records and redacted findings are considered. These materials extend beyond standard documentation, incorporating suppressed data, restricted experiments, and conclusions that have not been disseminated beyond the highest levels of inquisitorial authority. Access to the final tier of Inquisition, records concerning the Obliterator virus is restricted not only by clearance level, but by active redaction protocols that remove or fragment data even within authorized archives. What remains available is incomplete by design. Sections are excised, timelines are interrupted, and identifying details are stripped. The result is not a continuous narrative, but a series of partially preserved entries that must be interpreted in relation to one another. This fragmentation is not treated as an obstacle within the Inquisition. It is treated as a containment measure. The earliest classified entries differ from standard reports in tone and structure. They do not attempt to describe the virus as an isolated phenomenon. Instead, they position it within a broader category of convergent threats, where biological mutation, technological integration, and warp influence intersect. The Obliterator virus is referenced as one instance of this convergence, but not necessarily the only one. This reframing suggests that the virus is not an anomaly in isolation, but part of a larger pattern that may not yet be fully mapped. Several redacted files contain references to controlled observation programs. These programs are not described in full, but fragments indicate that inquisitorial authorities have, at times, allowed limited progression of infection under monitored conditions. The stated objective is to observe developmental thresholds, transmission variables, and potential points of intervention. Outcomes of these programs are not fully disclosed. However, repeated annotations indicate that containment failures occurred in multiple instances, leading to termination of both subjects and associated personnel. There are also indications of cross-ordo involvement. While most records fall under the purview of Ordo Malleus and Ordo Hereticus, certain entries include references to Ordo Xenos oversight. This is not explained directly, but it is associated with reports of the virus interacting with non-human biological systems. These interactions are not described in detail. Instead, they are marked as requiring further investigation and elevated clearance. The implication is that the virus's adaptability may extend beyond human or Astartes hosts, though this remains unconfirmed within accessible documentation. A subset of classified material addresses the question of origin with greater specificity, though not with greater certainty. Multiple entries reference attempts to trace the virus back to a single point of creation. These attempts are consistently inconclusive. In some cases, data suggests a connection to Dark Mechanicum experimentation within the Eye of Terror. In others, the trail leads to isolated incidents of warp exposure without clear technological involvement. There are also references to independent emergence in regions with no documented prior contact with known sources. This reinforces the earlier inquisitorial position that the virus may not have a singular origin. One recurring notation within redacted files is the phrase self-propagating doctrine. This terminology is not defined, but its usage implies that the virus is being considered not only as a biological or technological entity, but as a pattern of behavior that can replicate across different contexts. Under this interpretation, the Obliterator virus is less a fixed construct, and more a set of conditions that, once established, produce similar outcomes regardless of initial cause. This concept remains speculative and is not universally accepted within inquisitorial analysis. There are also classified entries that address the possibility of deliberate suppression of information. Certain reports indicate discrepancies between field data and archived records, suggesting that some encounters have been minimized, altered, or omitted entirely. The justification for this is not stated explicitly, but it aligns with broader inquisitorial practice of controlling information to prevent panic or unauthorized study. In the context of the Obliterator virus, this suppression may also serve to limit exposure to ideas or methods that could facilitate its spread. Another set of redacted files focuses on internal risk. These entries document concerns that the study of the virus itself may create pathways for contamination. Inquisitorial personnel assigned to long-term analysis exhibit higher rates of anomalous behavior, including increased fixation on weapon systems, altered communication patterns, and reduced adherence to standard protocol. While no direct cases of full infection within inquisitorial ranks are confirmed in accessible records, the correlation is noted and treated as a potential warning. There are also references to incidents involving Mechanicus collaboration that were terminated by inquisitorial intervention. In these cases, research efforts are described as exceeding acceptable limits, with experimental conditions approaching those required for active propagation. The outcomes of these interventions are heavily redacted, but annotations indicate that both data and personnel were subjected to purge protocols. This reinforces the Inquisition's position that the risks associated with controlled study may outweigh any potential benefits. A limited number of entries address the question of containment at a strategic level. These records do not propose eradication, which is acknowledged as currently unachievable. Instead, they outline containment as a process of disruption. This includes the targeted elimination of infected individuals, destruction of contaminated environments, and suppression of knowledge that could lead to further outbreaks. The effectiveness of these measures is not quantified, but they are presented as the only viable approach under current conditions. One of the most heavily redacted sections within the archive concerns long-term projections. What remains visible suggests that inquisitorial analysts do not view the current manifestation of the Obliterator virus as static. There are references to potential escalation, including increased rates of spread, greater integration with non-biological systems, and the emergence of forms that exceed the capabilities of known obliterators. These projections are not presented as certainties, but as scenarios that must be considered in ongoing threat assessment. In conclusion, the classified Inquisition perspective does not resolve the uncertainties surrounding the Obliterator virus. Instead, it expands them. The virus is not defined by a single origin, a fixed mechanism, or a stable endpoint. it is treated as a dynamic convergence of forces that can manifest in multiple forms and contexts. Its advantages in combat are acknowledged, but they are secondary to the broader implications of its existence. The Inquisition does not seek to understand the virus in the same way as the Adeptus Mechanicus, nor to integrate it into doctrine as the Adeptus Administrator might attempt through abstraction. Its primary objective is control through limitation. Where understanding cannot be achieved without risk, it is restricted. Where containment cannot be guaranteed, elimination is prioritized. The Obliterator Virus, as presented across all 3 chapters, remains a phenomenon that resists full integration into Imperial knowledge systems. In Chapter 1, it is defined through its biological and technological transformation. In Chapter 2, it is analysed through its impact on strategy, logistics, and battlefield behaviour. In Chapter 3, it is reframed as an evolving threat whose true scope may extend beyond current observation. Taken together, these perspectives do not form a complete picture. They form a boundary. Within that boundary lies what is known, what is inferred, and what is deliberately concealed. Beyond it lies the possibility that the Obliterator Virus is not an isolated corruption, but an early expression of a broader shift in the relationship between flesh, machine, and the warp. The archive concludes without resolution. The subject remains active.